Good evening, and welcome back to History Before Sleep channel. Tonight we are beginning a long, deeply immersive journey across the islands of Japan, an archipelago of mountains, forests, rivers, and unpredictable seas, where human history stretches across tens of thousands of years of profound survival. Japan today is a modern nation of immense cultural influence, celebrated globally for its advanced technology, its refined arts, its deep-rooted traditions, and its legendary resilience in the face of natural disaster. But like every great civilization that has ever left its mark upon the earth, it began in the earliest, most fragile stages of human settlement, with small, scattered groups of people, creating a unique way of life from the raw resources around them. Our task in this long-form series is to walk carefully, century by century, through the entire story of Japan, moving from these first prehistoric societies to the complex political landscapes of its modern age, letting the slow, steady rhythm of the narrative carry us deep into the memory of this island realm. So, before you get comfortable under the covers tonight, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the History Before Sleep channel, but only if you genuinely enjoy the quiet, deep storytelling we do here in the hours of the night. And while you are listening to the unfolding tale, let me know in the comments where you are in the world and what exact time it is as you join our small circle of nighttime historians, creating a shared space of calm reflection across the distances of the earth. Now, dim the lights completely, perhaps turn on a fan or a white noise machine for that soft, soothing background hum, and let your mind drift away as we begin tonight's long journey together into the gathering shadows of the Japanese past. The very first human presence in the Japanese islands can be traced back deep into the Paleolithic era, at least 35,000 years before our time, during a distant age when the geography of the planet was completely unrecognizable from the world we inhabit today. As the vast glaciers of the last great ice age locked up unthinkable volumes of the world's water in the northern poles, the global sea levels dropped drastically, drying out the shallow seas and exposing massive land bridges that connected the Asian mainland directly to the mountain ridges of Japan. Across these cold, tundra-covered land bridges, small family bands of archaic hunter-gatherers began to follow the migrations of large Ice Age mammals, tracking the giant woolly mammoths, the colossal elephants, and the heavy herds of deer as they moved across the northern plains from Siberia into Hokkaido, or crossed from the Korean peninsula into the green hills of Kyushu. These early pioneers carried nothing but simple, highly efficient stone tools, meticulously chipping local flint, quartz, and the dark, glassy shards of volcanic obsidian to fashion razor-sharp blades, scrapers, and heavy hand axes that allowed them to survive in a harsh, unforgiving wilderness. They left no grand monuments of stone and built no permanent villages, moving constantly with the changing of the seasons, sleeping in the shelter of natural limestone caves, or constructing temporary windbreaks from tree branches and the heavy skins of the animals they harvested along the river valleys. For tens of thousands of years, the quiet forests and misty valleys of the archipelago echoed only with the soft footsteps of these nomadic hunters, their presence recorded in the deep strata of the earth by nothing more than scattered clusters of charred wood from their ancient hearths and the broken blades they abandoned during the long, lonely winter hunts. As the thousands of years dissolved into the twilight of the Ice Age, around 14,000 years before the Common Era, a profound warming trend began to alter the climate of the entire planet, causing the colossal northern glaciers to melt under a warmer, more persistent sun. Unimaginable torrents of fresh water poured back into the world's oceans, causing the sea levels to rise by over 100 meters, swallowing the ancient land bridges and filling the deep channels to permanently isolate the Japanese archipelago from the Asian continent. This geographic isolation marked the birth of a completely unique era in human prehistory, a time of slow adaptation and spectacular artistic flowering known to modern historians as the Jōmon period, an age named for its distinctive pottery, decorated with intricate cord mark impressions pressed into the wet clay before firing. These vessels, recovered from the deep ruins of ancient coastal settlements, are among the absolute oldest known ceramics in the entire story of human civilization, proving that the early inhabitants of Japan had mastered the complex arts of firing clay long before the development of agriculture in the fertile valleys of the West. The Jōmon period would endure for an astonishing 10,000 years, extending until about 300 years before the Common Era, and in that immense, unbroken span of time, it produced a remarkably stable, creative, and peaceful culture that found a perfect equilibrium with the natural world around them. Unlike the early Neolithic populations of Europe and the Near East, who secured their survival through the hard, repetitive labor of farming and domesticating livestock, the Jōmon people remained hunter-gatherers, yet they achieved a level of social sophistication and permanent settlement that completely challenges our traditional understanding of primitive human societies. The secret to their incredible longevity lay in the rich, natural abundance of the Japanese islands, a landscape blessed with an intricate network of fast-flowing rivers, dense temperate forests rich in nut-bearing trees, and shallow coastal waters warmed by the great ocean currents that brought an infinite variety of marine life to their shores. The Jōmon families constructed permanent pit dwellings dug deep into the dark earth to insulate themselves from the winter cold, roofing their homes with heavy wooden beams and thick thatch spun from wild river reeds, grouping these structures into large, organized villages that often looked out over the gentle waters of a bay or nestled within the shelter of a fertile valley. Excavations of these ancient sites reveal highly structured communal spaces, with central plazas for ritual gatherings, specialized storage pits designed to preserve food supplies through seasons of scarcity, and ancestral burial grounds that demonstrate a deep, enduring connection to the lineage of their families. Their daily diet was remarkably varied and healthy, changing in harmony with the gentle turning of the seasons. As the men traveled into the thick forests of oak and beech to hunt wild boar, sika deer, and smaller game using beautifully crafted bows tipped with obsidian arrowheads. Along the rocky coastlines, the Jōmon families gathered an infinite wealth of shellfish, harvesting clams, oysters, and sea snails from the shallow lagoons, leaving behind colossal shell middens, massive heaps of discarded shells, mixed with animal bones, broken tools, and household debris that still stand today as monumental evidence of continuous human habitation spanning hundreds of generations over the plain. The deep forests of the interior provided another vital pillar for their survival, yielding a rich harvest of walnuts, chestnuts, and acorns that the Jōmon people learned to process with remarkable ingenuity, using large grinding stones to leach out the bitter tannins before baking the nut flour into nutritious cakes. This profound reliance on the seasonal fruits of the earth fostered a deep, spiritual reverence for the natural world, a cosmic outlook where every river, mountain peak, and ancient tree was believed to be inhabited by a unique, living spirit that required respect and propitiation. This early spiritual life found its material expression in the creation of dogu, mysterious clay figurines with exaggerated features and large, bug-like eyes that have been unearthed in vast numbers across the northern regions of Japan. These small statues, often broken deliberately before burial as part of a sacred ritual of healing or fertility, suggest a culture deeply attuned to the fragile cycles of life, death, and renewal, choosing to express its power not through the conquest of territory or the construction of massive stone walls, but through a harmonious alignment with the ecosystem that sustained them. As the thousands of years rolled on in a slow, peaceful procession, this ancient way of life remained completely unmarred by large-scale warfare or institutionalized hierarchy, creating a long era of cultural equilibrium that forms the absolute foundation of the Japanese spirit. A quiet dawn where the footprints of the first settlers were woven permanently into the soil of the islands, waiting through the long centuries for the arrival of new ideas that would steer the archipelago toward a dramatic, unprecedented future. To further understand the depth of this early Jōmon existence, we must look into the microscopic remnants left behind in the ancient soil of the Sanai Maruyama site, a massive settlement that flourished in the northern reaches of Honshu for over 1,500 years. Here, the archaeological layers reveal that the Jōmon people were not merely passive gatherers, but active managers of their environment, carefully cultivating extensive orchards of chestnut trees and organizing large-scale, communal efforts to harvest the rich seasonal runs of yellowtail and salmon from the cold ocean currents. The presence of sophisticated jade beads, imported from the distant mountains of Niigata, and rare obsidian blades carried across the open waters from the volcanic islands of Hokkaido, proves that these early communities maintained an intricate, peaceful network of long-distance trade that spanned the entire length of the archipelago. They lived in a world where time was measured, not by the decrees of kings or the borders of empires, but by the predictable migrations of the birds, the ripening of the forest fruits, and the changing position of the stars over the dark mountain ridges. This long, 10,000-year summer of human prehistory allowed the Jōmon culture to achieve a deep psychological harmony with the land, establishing a foundational worldview that would persist through the turbulent centuries of foreign contact and political consolidation, reminding the future generations that the true soul of Japan was born in the quiet of the primeval forests and the steady rhythm of the changing seasons. The timeless equilibrium of the Jōmon world, which had endured for 10,000 years across the misty valleys and coastal bays of the Japanese archipelago, began to experience a profound transformation as the first millennium before the Common Era drew toward its close. Far across the narrow straits that separated the islands from the Asian mainland, the currents of human migration and technological innovation were beginning to shift, carrying a tidal wave of new practices that would alter the landscape of Japan forever. Around the year 300 before the Common Era, though modern archaeological discoveries increasingly suggest these quiet influences began to trickle into the western gateways several centuries earlier, a completely new way of living burst onto the shores of northern Kyushu, marking the transition into the epoch known to history as the Yayoi period. This transitional era took its unique name from a quiet, historical district in Tokyo, where, in the closing decades of the 19th century, early scholars first unearthed a style of pottery that looked entirely alien to the ornate, cord-marked vessels of the prehistoric past. The clay jars of the Yayoi workshops abandoned the wild, sculptural decorations, the heavy coils, and the flame-like rims of the Jōmon masters in favor of a clean, symmetrical elegance, their unpainted surfaces turned on fast wheels and smoothed with a raw utility that signaled a profound change in the mind of the makers. This shift in the ceramic record was the surface reflection of a deep societal revolution, a monumental movement from the ancient patterns of foraging, fishing, and opportunistic hunting toward the highly disciplined, meticulously coordinated rhythms of wet rice agriculture and advanced metallurgy. The seeds of this transformation were carried across the turbulent ocean currents by small groups of continental migrants and traders, fleeing the intense political upheavals, wars, and nomadic pressures of the Asian mainland, bringing within their woven bags and small boats a technology that had already reached full maturity in the fertile lowlands of the Korean peninsula and China. They brought the practical knowledge of cultivating rice in irrigated paddies, a highly sophisticated form of farming that required a permanent, absolute mastery over the flow of water, forcing human communities to bend their daily lives to the strict, uncompromising requirements of the agricultural cycle. No longer could family bands wander freely through the deep oak forests or move their seasonal camps along the changing coastlines with the shifting migrations of the fish, for the newly cleared rice fields demanded a constant, sedentary devotion that chained the people to the specific soil they cultivated. To build a successful wet rice paddy, the early Yayoi villages had to work in perfect, disciplined cooperation, clearing the dense forest timber, constructing massive earthen dikes to enclose the muddy fields, leveling the terrain to ensure even water distribution, and digging intricate networks of irrigation canals to guide the fresh river waters across the flat plains. The shared labor gave birth to a new social structure, a collective intelligence where individual households realized that no single family could maintain the complex water channels, build the necessary dams, or defend the precious water sources from the caprices of nature and the hunger of outsiders alone. As the green carpets of the wet rice fields expanded northward and eastward from the warm, welcoming valleys of Kyushu into the wide, fertile plains of Honshu, the physical appearance of the Japanese village underwent a dramatic evolution, replacing the scattered, earth-sheltered pit dwellings of the prehistoric past with large, permanently fortified settlements. The Yayoi people raised their houses on sturdy wooden posts, constructing rectangular dwellings with elevated wooden floors and steep, thatched roofs that protected their living spaces from the dampness of the ground, insects, and the heavy summer rains. At the center of these bustling agricultural hubs, they erected monumental granaries, massive wooden storehouses raised high above the earth on stilts fitted with ingenious, smooth wooden discs designed specifically to prevent pests and rodents from devouring the winter reserves of grain. These elevated granaries became the true symbolic and economic heart of the community, representing the physical margin between survival and starvation, and within their shaded walls, the concept of private property, communal storage, and surplus wealth began to crystallize for the very first time in the story of the islands. For while a successful hunt or a bountiful harvest of forest nuts in the Jōmon era had to be consumed quickly before the elements claimed it, a massive storage of dried rice could be preserved for years, acting as a form of capital that allowed certain families to accumulate power, status, and permanent influence over those whose crops had failed due to weather or disease. This rising economic inequality jumps off the archaeological record, which reveals a stark, inescapable division within the ancient burial grounds that began to replace the simple, modest graves of the prehistoric past. Scribes of modern archaeology unearthing the late Yayoi tombs have discovered a highly stratified society where the vast majority of the population was laid to rest in simple earth trenches, jar burials, or modest stone cists with nothing but a few clay jars, while the highly privileged elite class was buried in colossal mound tombs surrounded by magnificent treasures. Within these rich elite graves, researchers have found a breathtaking array of prestige goods imported from the continent or forged by master local craftsmen, including heavy iron swords, polished jade beads, and magnificent bronze mirrors that reflected the light of the sun like pieces of fallen sky. The arrival of metallurgy was a double-featured miracle for the people of the islands. For unlike the long centuries of the West, where the Bronze Age preceded the development of iron by thousands of years, the Yayoi period introduced both bronze and iron to Japan in a single, overlapping wave of technological acceleration. Iron was immediately harnessed for raw utility, providing the workmen with durable axes to clear the ancient forests, heavy hooves to turn the stiff clay of the lowlands, and sharp sickles to harvest the heavy ears of grain during the golden months of autumn. Bronze, by contrast, was treated as a sacred, precious substance, reserved almost exclusively for the display of ritual authority, spiritual protection, and political prestige. Its smooth, polished metallic surface, embodying the divine connection between the rulers and the unseen forces of the cosmos. Among the most enigmatic artifacts left behind by this metal revolution were the dotaku, colossal bronze bells cast in sophisticated two-piece clay molds that have been discovered buried in quiet, isolated clusters across the hillsides of western Japan. These magnificent bells, completely devoid of clappers and often decorated with delicate, low-relief carvings of long-legged herons, praying mantises, architectural drawings of granaries, and scenes of men hunting deer or paddling canoes, were never meant to be rung for entertainment, acting instead as sacred instruments used in secret agricultural ceremonies to ensure the fertility of the rice fields and the favor of the earth. The deliberate burial of these precious bronze objects on lonely hills overlooking the farmlands suggests a society that still maintained a deep reverence for the local kami of the earth, using the luxury materials of the continent to sanctify their new, engineered relationship with the soil. Yet, this rising sophistication brought a dark, chilling companion that had been virtually invisible in the long, peaceful millennia of the Jōmon era, for the accumulation of land, water rights, and grain surpluses ignited an era of intense, competitive warfare across the archipelago. Excavations of late Yayoi settlements reveal that villages were no longer open, welcoming hamlets, but had been turned into tightly fortified strongholds, surrounded by deep, water-filled moats, massive earthen embankments, and high wooden palisades designed specifically to repel violent raiders. The skeletons, recovered from these centuries of conflict, carry the unmistakable marks of systemic violence, their bones pierced by heavy iron arrowheads, their skulls fractured by bronze swords, and their limbs severed by the sharp edge of battle axes, leaving a silent testament to a world where peace had vanished before the march of local ambition and territorial expansion. This era of fragmentation, local rivalries, and structural consolidation began to attract the attention of the great empires of the Asian mainland, and within the official historical chronicles of the Chinese courts, the first written descriptions of the Japanese islands began to appear, pulling the archipelago out of the mists of prehistory into the light of written records. These ancient Chinese texts described a distant land across the Eastern Sea that they called the country of Wa, a fragmented realm populated by over 100 independent, warring communities that sent regular tribute missions to the Han and Wei courts to secure the prestige of imperial recognition. The most famous of these accounts, preserved in the records of the Three Kingdoms, whispers of a magnificent kingdom named Yamato, which emerged from decades of civil war in the 3rd century of our era, under the rule of a charismatic queen named Himiko. This legendary queen, described as a powerful shamaness who occupied herself with the arts of magic and sorcery, lived in absolute, mysterious isolation within a vast, heavily fortified palace, guarded by 1,000 armed men, and served by a single male attendant who carried her commands to the outside world. Himiko managed to unite 30 of the warring states beneath her spiritual banner, sending a grand embassy across the sea to the Chinese emperor, who rewarded her with the title of Queen of Wa Friendly to Wei, alongside a gift of 100 bronze mirrors that cemented her supreme authority over her rivals. Though the precise geographic location of Yamato remains one of the greatest, most fiercely debated mysteries in the entire story of Japanese archaeology, the historical reality of Queen Himiko confirms that by the closing centuries of the Yayoi period, the scattered farming communities of the islands had evolved into recognizable political entities led by sophisticated rulers who could command the labor and loyalty of vast populations. To further explore this Emerald Revolution, we must look at the immense archaeological remains at the Yoshinagari site in Saga Prefecture, where a massive, ditch-enclosed settlement spanning tens of acres has been meticulously uncovered by modern researchers. Here, the double moats, the high watchtowers, and the grand burial mounds of the ruling elites provide an undeniable physical blueprint of a society that had fully embraced the complexities of the agricultural age, establishing a disciplined way of life where the collective survival of the village was bound permanently to the success of the harvest and the authority of the leaders. The seeds of centralization, iron technology, and agricultural mastery had been planted deep within the soil of Japan, setting the stage for a transformation that would turn the narrow, fertile basins of central Honshu into a brilliant, unified state, changing the path of the islands forever. The spiritual authority and political consolidation that had crystallized during the twilight of the Yayoi period reached a monumental climax in the 3rd century of the Common Era, drawing the center of gravity away from the western shores of Kyushu toward the fertile, landlocked plains of central Honshu. This new geographic anchor, nestled within the narrow, mountain-ringed basin of the Yamato Plain in modern-day Nara, became the cradle of a true unified state that would provide the continuous lineage for the imperial institution of Japan. As the independent chiefdoms and rival agricultural clans realized that survival in a highly militarized world required a shared loyalty, they slowly bound their separate destinies to a dominant lineage of rulers who claimed a divine, undisputed mandate to govern the islands. This profound historical transition marked the birth of the Kofun period, an era that took its name from the colossal, earthwork mound tombs that began to rise like artificial mountains across the landscape of Japan, serving as a physical testament to the immense power, wealth, and administrative maturity of the early Yamato rulers. These magnificent tombs, constructed with an absolute mathematical precision, were shaped like gigantic keyholes when viewed from the heavens, featuring a circular mound at the rear, where the sacred remains of the leader were interred, connected to a wide, triangular platform at the front, designed for the performance of grand ritual ceremonies. The construction of a single, large kofun was an epic engineering feat that required the coordinated labor of thousands of skilled workers over the course of several years, forcing the state to develop a highly sophisticated system of registered labor, resource management, and mathematical planning. The largest of these monuments, the breathtaking Daisen-ryo Kofun, traditionally attributed to the resting place of Emperor Nintoku, measures nearly 500 meters in length. Its massive terraced flanks, surrounded by 3 separate, water-filled moats, and coated in millions of smooth river stones that glittered under the blinding heat of the sun. To look upon these earthwork mountains from the flat plains was to understand the absolute supremacy of the Yamato throne, a visual statement of dominance written directly into the topography of the land, demonstrating to every regional lord that the central authority possessed a power that stretched far beyond the boundaries of any ordinary clan. As archaeologists carefully cleared away the deep layers of earth from the inner chambers of these ancient mounds, they discovered that the Yamato elites were laid to rest within heavy stone sarcophagi, surrounded by an astonishing wealth of material culture that reflected both exquisite local craftsmanship and intense diplomatic connections with the Kasumi, kingdoms of the Asian continent. In the earlier centuries of the period, the grave goods were predominantly ritual and spiritual in nature, filled with beautifully polished bronze mirrors imported from the workshops of Han China, delicate jade beads fashioned into the shape of crescent moons, and sacred iron staffs that signaled the ruler's role as an intermediary between the human world and the divine. But as the centuries advanced into the 5th and 6th hundred years of our era, the contents of the tombs underwent a dramatic, chilling shift, reflecting a society that had become deeply militarized and connected to the horsemanship cultures of the Korean peninsula. The ritual mirrors faded away, replaced by heavy iron swords of incredible quality, magnificent suits of articulated iron plate armor that protected the torso of the warrior, and elaborate bronze horse trappings, including stirrups, bits, and gilded saddle plaques that showed the Yamato elites had mastered the arts of cavalry warfare. Surrounding the outer terraces of these massive earthworks, placed in long, orderly rows, like silent sentinels guarding the slumber of the dead, were thousands of haniwa, hollow terracotta cylinders, topped with beautifully expressive clay sculptures that offer an intimate, cinematic window into the daily life of the early Yamato state. These small clay figures, shaped by the hands of master potters, depicted every element of the social hierarchy, including fierce, helmeted warriors bearing heavy longbows, noble courtiers dressed in loose, patterned robes, musicians strumming primitive stringed instruments, and common farmers holding hoes alongside beautifully detailed models of houses, granaries, and domestic animals. The haniwa were more than mere artistic adornment, serving a practical engineering purpose by holding the loose earth of the terraced mounds in place against the erosion of the heavy summer rains, while simultaneously forming a spiritual barrier that separated the sacred sanctuary of the deceased ruler from the profane world of the living. The sheer variety and quality of these clay statues demonstrate a highly specialized economy where the court could support permanent guilds of artisans, scribes, and metalworkers who dedicated their entire lives to the service of the state. The political architecture of this emerging nation-state revolved around a complex, sophisticated system of clans, known as the uji, powerful aristocratic families that each controlled their own ancestral lands, commanded private retinues of warriors, and traced their lineage directly back to a specific guardian deity, or kami. The Yamato court mediated between these competing noble houses by establishing a rigid hierarchy of hereditary titles, placing the leader of the dominant Yamato lineage at the absolute summit of the pyramid as the Great King, an early monarch who maintained control not through an all-powerful, centralized bureaucracy, but through a delicate network of marriage alliances, personal loyalties, and religious prestige. Attached to these aristocratic uji were the specialized occupational groups of common laborers, farmers, fishermen, and weavers who were organized by the state to provide specific goods and services to the royal court, creating a highly organized economic system that could systematically extract the wealth of the countryside to fund the grand building projects of the capital. To explore this era of structural growth further, we must trace the expanding footprint of the Yamato presence into the remote frontiers of the Kanto Plain and the distant coasts of the Sea of Japan, where smaller keyhole tombs began to mirror the exact geometric proportions of the central Nara mounds. This architectural replication provides undeniable proof of a shared political identity, showing that regional chieftains, voluntarily or through military coercion, sought to align their own local prestige with the supreme authority of the Yamato center. The tombs also hold clues to an expanding diplomatic network, as seen in the recovery of exquisite glass vessels that traveled the thousands of miles of the Silk Road from the Roman Empire to be buried in the dark soil of Honshu. These luxury goods, alongside deep stores of continental iron ingots, allowed the Yamato court to distribute priceless prestige items to loyal regional allies, effectively cementing a multi-provincial coalition that would outlast the individual tribal rivalries of the era. To legitimize this rising social structure and bind the disparate clans into a single, permanent national consciousness, the Yamato rulers drew deeply upon the universal language of native mythology, formalizing the ancient, localized rituals of kami worship into a grand state religion that would later be known to the world as Shinto. The great king asserted a supreme spiritual authority by claiming direct, unbroken descent from Amaterasu Omikami, the magnificent goddess of the sun who illuminated the world and blessed the rice fields of Japan with her radiant warmth. By establishing the imperial house as the ultimate earthly lineage of the sun goddess, the Yamato court elevated the person of the monarch above the realm of common politics, turning the service to the throne into a sacred, cosmic duty that synchronized the harmony of the state with the changing of the seasons and the will of the heavens. This profound religious authority allowed the Yamato state to withstand the intense rivalries of the noble houses, creating a permanent, symbolic center of gravity that would guide the evolution of Japan from a collection of prehistoric agricultural communities into a sophisticated, recognized kingdom, prepared to step out of the shadows of prehistory and enter the grand community of East Asian nations. The spiritual and political landscape of the Yamato state, which had been anchored for centuries in the monumental tombs of the Kofun period and the sacred lineage of the sun goddess, encountered a profound cultural revolution in the middle of the 6th century. Across the narrow sea lanes, the diplomatic networks connecting Japan with the Korean peninsula brought an official embassy from the kingdom of Baekje to the court of the Yamato monarch in the year 552. This historic mission carried magnificent diplomatic gifts intended to forge a binding alliance between the two realms, presenting the Japanese ruler with a brilliant bronze statue of the Buddha, several volumes of sacred sutras inscribed in fine continental characters, and a retinue of holy monks who could explain the path to enlightenment. This moment marked the official arrival of Buddhism in Japan, a spiritual event that did not merely introduce a new vision of the cosmos, but triggered an intense, decades-long political struggle that would determine the administrative future of the entire archipelago. For the traditional noble houses of the Yamato court, the introduction of this foreign faith presented a direct challenge to the ancient structures of power, dividing the aristocracy into two fiercely competitive factions, the Mononobe and Nakatomi clans, who derived their high status and political influence from their traditional roles as the guardians of native kami rituals and imperial purification ceremonies, resisted the new religion with a visceral dread, arguing that the adoption of a foreign deity would insult the ancestral spirits of the land and bring down the devastating wrath of the heavens in the form of plagues and natural disasters. Opposing them was the Soga clan, an ambitious, noble house with deep ties to continental immigrants, who recognized that Buddhism carried not only a profound spiritual depth, but also the immense prestige, literacy, and administrative technologies of the advanced civilizations of China and Korea. The Soga believed that by embracing this universal faith, the Yamato court could surpass the localized rivalries of the clans, reinforcing a highly centralized, modern state structure that would align Japan with the great empires of the Asian mainland. This simmering rivalry erupted into an outright civil conflict that was fully decided on the battlefield in the late 6th century, when the military forces of the Soga clan utterly crushed the traditionalist Mononobe alliance, establishing their absolute dominance over the royal court. The true golden age of this cultural synthesis found its ultimate champion in the person of Prince Shotoku, a brilliant intellectual and statesman of mixed Soga and imperial blood who served as the royal regent during the opening decades of the 7th century. Prince Shotoku looked out at a Japan still fractured by tribal loyalties, and he realized that Buddhism could serve as a magnificent spiritual cement to bind the hearts of the people, while Confucian philosophy could provide the practical, ethical framework required to organize a disciplined government bureaucracy. He became a passionate patron of the new faith, sponsoring the construction of magnificent temple complexes that transformed the architectural landscape of central Honshu, most famously the Horyuji Temple near Nara, whose soaring wooden pagodas and elegant halls still stand today as some of the oldest continuously surviving wooden structures on the face of the planet. Within the quiet scriptoriums of these newly erected sanctuaries, Prince Shotoku and his chosen scholars labored to master the complex language of the continental texts, composing detailed commentaries on the Holy Sutras and integrating the ethical principles of the continent directly into the legal consciousness of the state. In the year 604, the prince promulgated the historic 17-article constitution, a monumental document that was not a legal code in the modern administrative sense, but a profound set of moral and philosophical guidelines designed to govern the conduct of state officials and unify the minds of the ruling class. The very first article of this text established harmony as the ultimate virtue of human society, warning that when factions and clan rivalries dominate the court, the path of justice is broken and the state falls into ruin. The second article explicitly commanded the people to deeply revere the three treasures, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, marking the first time that a universal, philosophical faith was written into the foundational moral fabric of the Japanese state. The constitution seamlessly blended these spiritual demands with the practical wisdom of Confucianism, declaring in the subsequent articles that the commands of the sovereign must be obeyed with absolute, meticulous diligence, comparing the relationship between the monarch and the subject to the harmony of the heavens and the earth, where the sky provides the rain and the soil receives it to bring forth life. Officials were castigated for private greed and urged to handle public matters with an unblemished integrity, ensuring that the grievances of the common farmers were heard at the palace gates without the distortion of bribery or favoritism. Prince Shotoku understood that true authority could not reside in the crude use of physical violence or the arbitrary power of hereditary clans, requiring an objective, moral standard of merit, education, and duty that elevated the person of the emperor as the sole divinely ordained axis of the state. To deepen this historical narrative further, we must trace the expanding physical reality of this religious transition, as seen in the casting of the historic Asuka Daibutsu, a majestic bronze Buddha commissioned by the Soga clan immediately following their battlefield victory. This early masterpiece, cast under the guidance of master sculptor Toribushi, a descendant of continental immigrants, displayed an elongated, ethereal style that captured the transcendent calm of the continent, contrasting sharply with the solid, earthbound haniwa of the past. The creation of such art required an entirely new framework of patronage, drawing heavy imports of copper and gold from the northern mountains and establishing specialized state workshops where artisans labored under the protection of the court. These temples quickly evolved into the primary centers of advanced learning across the plain, housing ancient medical manuals, astronomical charts, and early architectural guides that allowed the Japanese state to train a new generation of literate administrators. To cement this rising political identity on the international stage, Prince Shotoku initiated a series of grand diplomatic missions to the Sui dynasty of China, sending young Japanese scholars, monks, and administrators across the dangerous, stormy seas to study the advanced models of continental governance, law, and urban planning. In a famous, highly defiant letter sent to the Chinese court, the prince addressed the continent as the land where the sun sets, while describing Japan as the land where the sun rises, a calculated, poetic statement that declared the absolute sovereignty and equal dignity of the Japanese monarch before the ancient empires of the world. Though the prince passed away before his grandest visions of a fully centralized state could be completely realized, his intellectual and spiritual legacy was permanent, transforming Buddhism from a foreign curiosity into a core pillar of national identity, and establishing a sophisticated synthesis of native and imported ideas that would guide the evolution of Japan for centuries to come, as the country took its first full step into the community of nations. The moral and philosophical foundations laid down by Prince Shotoku during the opening decades of the 7th century were destined to face a trial of fire and blood as the individual clans struggled to retain their traditional autonomy against the rising tide of centralized statehood. Following the passing of the prince, the Soga clan, who had once been the primary champions of Buddhism and modernization, succumbed to the corrupting influence of absolute power, their leaders executing rivals with a ruthless arrogance and attempting to overshadow the imperial family itself. In the hot summer of the year 645, this intolerable hubris provoked a violent, dramatic coup at the royal court in the region of Asuka, a momentous event known to history as the Ishii Incident. A young, brilliant imperial prince named Naka no Oe, joining forces with a shrewd aristocratic strategist named Nakatomi no Kamatari, staged a daring ambush within the grand audience hall of the palace, assassinating the tyrannical Soga leader before the very eyes of the empress, an act of supreme political violence that broke the backbone of the clan and placed the destiny of Japan into the hands of a new group of radical reformers. With their rivals completely eliminated, Prince Naka no Oe, who would later ascend the throne as the legendary Emperor Tenji, and Kamatari, who was granted the prestigious surname of Fujiwara as a reward for his loyalty, initiated a sweeping, unprecedented program of national restructuring known as the Taika Reforms, a phrase that carried a defiant political declaration meaning the Great Change. The ultimate objective of these historic decrees was to dismantle the ancient, fragmented system of clan landholdings and private tribal labor, replacing it with a highly structured, centralized bureaucracy modeled directly on the magnificent administrative machinery of the Tang dynasty of China. The reformers understood that if Japan were to survive as an independent sovereign nation in an era of imperial expansion across East Asia, the state could no longer operate as a loose coalition of noble families, requiring an absolute, unquestioned concentration of power beneath the single axis of the imperial throne. The very first and most revolutionary decree of the Taika Reforms struck a mortal blow to the economic power of the traditional aristocracy, declaring that all land and all people across the archipelago belonged exclusively to the emperor, transforming the private fields of the clans into public imperial territory. Under this new legal framework, known as the Richurio system, the state asserted an unprecedented authority to control the resources of the countryside, initiating a massive, nationwide census to meticulously register every single household, every acre of fertile soil, and every grain of agricultural productivity. The land was then systematically redistributed back to the common farmers, based on the size of their families, ensuring that every household possessed enough ground to sustain its children, while simultaneously locking the population into a rigid, permanent matrix of state obligations. In exchange for their state-allocated fields, the peasants were required to pay a consistent, standardized tax directly to the central government, delivering their revenues in the form of fine rice, beautifully woven hemp cloth, and several months of hard manual labor to construct the grand highways and public works of the growing capital. To enforce these sweeping changes across the distant provinces, the reformers bypassed the traditional hereditary clan leaders, dividing the geography of Japan into orderly provinces and districts overseen by professional governors who were appointed directly by the court for fixed terms, creating a unified administrative network that stretched from the shores of Kyushu to the northern frontiers of Honshu. These provincial governors traveled along newly constructed imperial highways that linked the provinces to the capital, ensuring that the wealth of the countryside flowed smoothly into the state treasury and that the laws of the central court were executed with a uniform precision. Along these same strategic roads, the government established a comprehensive system of military garrisons, utilizing a new law of universal conscription that required 1/3 of all able-bodied common men to serve in the state infantry, transforming the traditional monopoly on warfare from a privilege of the samurai clans into a sacred, collective duty of citizenship that bound the common farmer to the defense of the throne. This immense restructuring of society required an absolute mastery over the written word, prompting the Yamato court to adopt the complex Chinese writing system as the official medium of state administration, law, and diplomacy, creating the world's first true paper-based bureaucracy in the story of the islands. Though the Japanese spoken language belonged to an entirely separate family with distinct grammatical roots and vocabulary, the early scribes learned to use the continental characters as a sophisticated administrative code, using the characters to record the tax registers, frame the codes of law, and compose the official correspondence that bound the empire together. This digital-like transition from a memory-based oral culture to an enduring written archive allowed the central government to accumulate knowledge over generations, stabilizing the power of the throne and providing subsequent rulers with a mathematical precision that transformed the scattered agricultural communities of Japan into a unified, recognized nation-state. To delve deeper into this era of legislative transformation, we must observe how the Ritsuryo codes reshaped the internal life of the provinces, particularly through the Taiho Code compiled in the early 8th century, which formalized the penal and administrative laws into a singular, monumental text. Under these laws, the common farmers found themselves woven into local administrative units called Go, groups of 50 households bound by a system of collective responsibility, ensuring that if a single member fled the land or failed to meet their tax quotas, the remaining families were legally obligated to clear the debt. This ironclad organization allowed the court to stabilize its revenues, mapping the agricultural yields of distant valleys with a rigorous ledger system managed by central scribes. At the same time, the codification of crimes and punishments established an objective framework of justice, ensuring that the arbitrary executions practiced by prehistoric chieftains were replaced by institutional trials, overseen by legal specialists appointed by the state. The spiritual life of the Asuka era reflected this rising political centralization, seamlessly weaving the imported architecture of Buddhism with the traditional rituals of native kami worship to provide a dual, unblemished sacred foundation for the emerging state. The court sponsored the construction of magnificent state-funded monasteries and temples that rose like monuments to sophistication across the capital, their rectangular layouts, tiled roofs, and brilliant bronze statues signaling to both allies and foreign envoys that the Japanese monarch ruled as an enlightened, progressive sovereign who possessed the favor of both the earthly spirits and the cosmic Buddhas. By linking the political order of the Taika reforms to the universal ethics of Buddhism and the divine lineage of Shinto, the Asuka reformers succeeded in creating a resilient state identity that survived the intense internal friction of the century, setting the stage for an era of spectacular cultural expansion where the majesty of the throne would be written permanently into the physical geography of Japan's first true permanent capitals. The administrative and economic consolidation of the Asuka reforms reached a spectacular, visible maturity at the dawn of the 8th century, as the imperial court realized that its rising power required a permanent, monumental ome. For generations, the capital of Japan had shifted with the ascension of every new monarch, a restless movement driven by the deep Shinto belief that the death of a sovereign polluted the spiritual purity of the palace. But as the Ritsuryo state matured into a complex bureaucracy, this cyclical relocation became an intolerable logistical burden, demanding the creation of a vast, unmoving axis that could project the eternal majesty of the throne. In the year 710, under the direction of Empress Genpei, the court founded its first true permanent capital, Heian, in the fertile heart of the Nara Basin, inaugurating a magnificent 80-year epoch known to history as the Nara period. Heian was constructed as a brilliant, scale model replica of Chang'an, the colossal capital of Tang Dynasty, China, its grid-like topography reflecting the sophisticated geometric philosophy of continental urban planning. A massive, 80-meter-wide central avenue divided the metropolis into two symmetrical halves, cutting through orderly blocks of administrative offices, bustling marketplaces, and aristocratic mansions, all leading toward the grand imperial palace complex, situated at the absolute northern summit of the axis. This highly organized urban plan was a physical manifestation of the state's desire for absolute order, a visual statement that positioned the emperor as the immovable North Star around whom the entire hierarchy of society revolved. Within these thick, sun-dried brick walls, the court aristocrats cultivated an era of unparalleled refinement, spending their days managing the provincial tax registers, conducting elaborate diplomatic ceremonies for foreign envoys, and mastering the subtle arts of calligraphy, music, and poetry. The spiritual life of the Nara capital was dominated by a profound, unparalleled alliance between the imperial throne and the rising institutions of Buddhism, which had grown so wealthy and influential that they functioned as a core apparatus of the state. To secure the cosmic protection of the heavens for a nation long plagued by smallpox epidemics and regional rebellions, Emperor Shomu initiated a monumental, nationwide religious campaign known as the Kokubunji system. This ambitious decree required every single province across the archipelago to construct a state-funded monastery and nunnery under imperial patronage, creating a vast, spiritual grid that mirrored the political administration of the empire. The absolute climax of this state-sponsored piety rose at the center of the capital itself, within the magnificent complex of Todaiji Temple, where thousands of master artisans, engineers, and common laborers spent nearly a decade completing an epic engineering feat that stunned the contemporary world. This feat was the casting of the Daibutsu, a colossal bronze statue of the cosmic Vairocana Buddha that rose over 15 meters into the air, its smooth, gilded form held together within the largest wooden building ever erected on the face of the earth. The creation of this giant Buddha consumed the economic resources of the entire nation, requiring over 400 tons of liquid bronze, thousands of kilograms of pure gold to coat its metallic skin, and the hard manual labor of over 2 million citizens who gathered from across the provinces to clear the forests and transport the massive cedar timbers from the mountains. When the eyes of the great statue were finally painted open during a grand international ceremony in the year 752, surrounded by hundreds of foreign monks from China, India, and Korea, the Daibutsu stood as a physical monument to the complete unification of Japan, demonstrating that the native realm had successfully woven its identity into the universal tapestry of East Asian civilization. To fully grasp the immense scope of this era, we must also examine the deep undercurrents of strain that this massive spiritual mobilization placed upon the common people across the plain. The continuous demands for taxes, copper mines, and heavy physical labor pushed many farming villages to the absolute edge of exhaustion, prompting some families to abandon their fields and flee into the mountains to escape the state registers. To counterbalance these internal pressures and preserve the absolute authority of the throne, the court turned to the power of historical preservation, utilizing specialized scribes to record the official memory of the state. It was during these intense centuries of construction that the court completed the preservation of the ancient oral traditions, finalizing the permanent written legacy of the nation's origin myths. In the quiet libraries of the capital, court scholars compiled the historic Kojiki, the records of ancient matters, in 712, followed closely by the completion of the Nihon Shoki, the Chronicles of Japan, in 720. Monumental texts written in continental characters that meticulously recorded the myths, genealogies, and early history of the islands. These sacred chronicles served a vital political purpose, systematically tracing the lineage of the imperial house back through the mists of time to the sun goddess Amaterasu, transforming oral legends into an unblemished, written history that legitimized the absolute authority of the throne for generations to come. Parallel to these grand histories was the assembly of the Manyoshu, the collection of 10,000 leaves, a breathtaking anthology of over 4,000 poems composed by emperors, noble courtiers, and humble frontier soldiers alike, capturing the deep, emotional soul of a people who celebrated the beauty of the cherry blossoms, lamented the transience of life, and sang of their duty to the state with a brilliant, enduring, poetic vitality. The magnificent alliance between the imperial throne and the grand Buddhist monasteries of Nara, which had birthed the colossal Daibutsu and the statewide temple network, eventually generated an atmosphere of intense political claustrophobia. By the closing decades of the 8th century, the wealth and territorial exemptions of the great clergy had grown so immense that influential monks began to step directly into the corridors of government, threatening to reduce the emperor to a mere instrument of the temples. To preserve the independent authority of the Ritsuryo state, Emperor Kanmu made a radical, definitive choice to abandon Heijokyo entirely, seeking a fresh frontier far away from the entrenched religious factions of the south. After a brief, troubled stay at Nagaoka, the court finally established its permanent home in the year 794 within the scenic, mountain-sheltered valley of Heian-kyo, the city that would be celebrated across the centuries as Kyoto, inaugurating a magnificent 400-year epoch known to history as the Heian period. Heian-kyo, meaning the capital of peace and tranquility, was meticulously arranged in a monumental grid pattern that echoed the continental symmetry of its predecessors, but its soul shifted toward a uniquely Japanese expression of aesthetic refinement and political isolation. Within this airy, willow-lined metropolis, the central bureaucracy of the state gradually ossified, allowing the practical administration of the distant provinces to slip away while the court aristocracy turned inward, transforming their daily lives into an intense, hyper-refined performance of etiquette, rank, and artistic judgment. The traditional Ritsuryo laws of universal land nationalization and regular census-taking faded into memory as powerful noble families, most notably the brilliant, calculating Fujiwara clan, orchestrated a sophisticated monopoly over the levers of central power. The Fujiwara masters realized that they did not need to overthrow the sacred imperial line to rule the empire, instead, choosing to marry their daughters to young, malleable emperors and serving as regents who managed the daily affairs of state from the shaded chambers of their private mansions. This total insulation of the ruling elite from the raw, practical struggles of the provinces birthed a distinct cultural environment where distinction was measured not by military prowess or economic management, but by an absolute mastery over the subtle nuances of art, poetry, and emotional sensitivity. Status was everything in Heian society, determining the exact color and weight of the silk robes a courtier could wear, the height of the carriage they could ride through the streets, and the specific level of formal language they could use in correspondence. The aristocratic mansions, constructed in the delicate Shinden-zukuri style, featured open wooden pavilions, sliding screens, and verandas that looked out over large, meticulously contemplated ponds, creating an environment where the changing of the seasons became the primary event of human existence. Courtiers spent their hours participating in formal poetry competitions, listening to the soft strumming of lutes in the dark, and exchanging waka poems, short, 31-syllable verses that served as the primary currency of romance, diplomacy, and political maneuvering at court. It was within this delicate, highly scrutinized world that the true genius of Japanese literature blossomed, driven almost entirely by the brilliant women of the court who used a new, phonetic writing system known as kana to bypass the rigid, formal Chinese characters reserved for male administration. This phonetic script allowed for a direct, fluid expression of the human heart, resulting in the creation of some of the greatest masterpieces of world literature, including the monumental tale of Genji, written in the early 11th century by Murasaki Shikibu, a lady-in-waiting to the empress. Often celebrated as the world's first true psychological novel, this epic work follows the intricate life, political intrigues, and romantic journeys of the shining Prince Genji, capturing the profound aesthetic philosophy that defined the soul of the era. This outlook was centered on mono no aware, a deep, beautiful, and melancholy awareness of the absolute impermanence of all things, a realization that the exquisite brilliance of a cherry blossom or the joy of a human connection is made all the more precious precisely because it is destined to fade into the sand. To comprehend the full architecture of this cloistered world, we must also examine the private networks of economic power that sustained the capital's luxury from afar. As the central court abandoned the active management of the countryside, the land fractured into thousands of private, tax-exempt estates, called shun, which were controlled by aristocratic families and remote religious institutions. These shun grew rapidly across the plains, completely starving the central imperial treasury of its traditional revenues, while flooding the private coffers of the Kyoto nobility with an abundance of silk, lumber, and fine grain. This economic distortion allowed the high courtiers to completely detach themselves from the physical realities of the landscape, spending vast fortunes on rare incense components imported from southern seas and financing elaborate temple expansions to secure spiritual merit. The daily rhythms of the palace became entirely detached from the passage of time in the outer world, moving only to the synchronized progression of courtly festivals and private artistic duels. Parallel to Murasaki's great work was the Pillow Book, composed by her literary rival, Sei Shonagon, a collection of witty observations, private lists, and sharp critiques that vividly convey the daily sensory experience of the courtly world. Shonagon wrote of the simple beauty of a summer night when the fireflies flicker through the dark, the crisp elegance of a charcoal burner in the winter, and the quiet frustrations of handling unrefined commoners who blundered through the sacred rules of etiquette. Yet, while the elite circles of Kyoto were completely absorbed in the cultivation of calligraphy, the blending of exotic perfumes, and the staging of elaborate seasonal rituals, a quiet, dangerous vacuum was forming across the physical geography of the provinces. By granting massive tax exemptions to the private estates of the nobility and the great monasteries, the central court had slowly starved itself of revenue, leaving the local communities to defend their own borders from bandits and regional unrest without the protection of a state military. In this shadow of neglect, far from the polished verandas of Heian, a new social class of pragmatic, armed landholders was quietly sharpening its blades, ready to step out of the provincial wilderness and shatter the fragile, poetic peace of the aristocratic world forever. The poetic elegance and hyper-refined isolation that had defined the courts of Kyoto for nearly 4 centuries created an illusion of permanent peace. But the structural mechanics of the empire were quietly generating a dangerous, volatile energy along the rugged frontiers of the land. While the Fujiwara regents and noble courtiers spent their days debating the subtle placement of calligraphy characters or the specific layers of silk required for a seasonal festival, the practical reality of maintaining order across the provinces had been completely abandoned by the central state. To protect their boundaries from predatory bandits, sea pirates, and the hostile clans of the far north, the wealthy regional landholders and estate managers realized they could no longer look to the capital for salvation, forced instead to take up the bow, the horse, and the spear to forge their own security networks. This pragmatic, frontier struggle gave birth to a new social class of professional warriors, known to history as the bushi, or the samurai, men whose lives revolved not around the sensitivity of mono no aware, but around the cold, uncompromising laws of martial discipline and absolute clan loyalty. The true centers of this warrior awakening were situated far from the soft, willow-lined avenues of Kyoto, taking root within the wild, mist-shrouded plains of the Kanto region in eastern Japan, and the rugged valleys of northern Honshu, where life was constant, heavy, and balanced upon the sharp edge of survival. Here, the early samurai leaders developed a unique lifestyle, completely distinct from the courtly elite, spending their hours mastering the arts of horsemanship, tactical maneuvering, and the use of the massive, asymmetrical longbow that could pierce a sheet of iron plate from a distance of 100 meters. They bound their small family groups into larger, highly disciplined military organizations through the system of the Uji, passing down their lethal martial skills, their prized weapons, and their ancestral horse bloodlines from father to son across generations of continuous struggle. This lifestyle fostered a rigid, uncompromising code of honor that prized personal courage, physical endurance, and a readiness to look into the face of death without a single blink, laying down the early, raw foundations for what would later be celebrated across the world as Bushido, the way of the warrior. To fully understand the growth of this warrior consciousness, we must look at the physical tools and martial philosophies that carved their way into the landscape during this era of deep division. The early samurai did not yet wield the iconic curved katana of the later centuries, relying instead on the heavy, straight-bladed tachi suspended edge down from their belts, and wearing complex lamellar armor known as oyoroi, designed specifically to absorb the impact of arrows fired from horseback. These heavy suits, constructed from thousands of individual iron and leather scales, laced together with fine silk cords, were color-coded to represent the proud lineage of the house, turning each mounted warrior into a distinct, moving fortress on the field. The psychological bond between the warrior and his weapons became a sacred tenet of their daily rituals, with the bow treated as a living extension of the samurai's spirit, purified through silent contemplation before every excursion into the wilderness. The imperial court in Kyoto, blind to the changing balance of power, increasingly treated these provincial warriors as a crude, subhuman class of enforcers, utilizing them as bodyguards to patrol the outer palace gates, or commissioning them to suppress local rebellions when the state authorities ran out of resources. Successful samurai commanders were rewarded with low-ranking court titles and minor administrative posts, a policy that unintentionally allowed the provincial clans to establish a permanent foothold within the political architecture of the capital. Two great, hyper-competitive warrior dynasties emerged from this military expansion, both tracing their ultimate ancestry back to younger sons of past emperors who had left the crowded capital to seek fortune in the wilderness. The proud, crimson-bannered Taira clan, who built their wealth along the coastal sea lanes of western Japan, and the relentless, white-bannered Minamoto clan, who commanded the fierce mounted archers of the eastern plains. The simmering friction between these two iron dynasties erupted into the open during the middle of the 12th century, when deep, factional disputes over imperial succession and regency split the Kyoto court into violent, desperate cliques that realized they could no longer resolve their rivalries through words alone. Both the Taira and the Minamoto were summoned into the capital by competing noble factions, transforming the ancient sanctuaries and gardens of Kyoto into a chaotic, blood-soaked battlefield during the historic Hogan and Heiji rebellions. The conflict was savage, and under the brilliant, calculating leadership of Taira no Kiyomori, the Crimson Warriors utterly broke the forces of the Minamoto, executing their older commanders and establishing an unprecedented monopoly over the imperial court that shocked the traditional aristocracy. Kiyomori moved his warriors directly into the highest offices of the land, marrying his own daughter to the young emperor and ruling the empire with a military arrogance that systematically dismantled the old monopoly of the Fujiwara clan. Yet, this sudden transition from provincial warriors to court aristocrats proved to be the undoing of the Taira house, for as they settled into the beautiful palaces of Kyoto, adopting the fine silk robes, the elegant banquettes, and the soft lifestyles of the courtiers, they slowly lost their old, lethal edge and alienated the very samurai who had carried them to power. Far to the east, within the isolated sanctuary of Kamakura, a surviving Minamoto prince named Minamoto no Yoritomo had spent his years of exile in quiet, meticulous preparation, watching the mistakes of his rivals and building a massive, highly loyal coalition of Eastern warrior clans who hungered for a total redistribution of the nation's wealth. In the autumn of the year 1180, when a disaffected imperial prince issued a secret call to arms to rid the realm of Taira dominance, Yoritomo unfurled his white banners, igniting a cataclysmic, nationwide civil war known to history as the Genpei War, a monumental clash of bronze, iron, and leather that would sweep across the entire archipelago, changing the destination of Japan forever. The unfurling of the white banners across the eastern plains of Kanto signaled the opening of a cataclysmic chapter in the story of the islands, a 5-year storm of unprecedented violence that would pit brother against brother and sweep the old order of Kyoto into the deep. This was the Genpei War, a nationwide civil war that was far more than a simple struggle between the Taira and Minamoto clans, representing a total volcanic eruption of the provincial warrior class against the ancient, tax-draining monopoly of the court aristocracy. Minamoto no Yoritomo, governing his expanding coalition from the remote coastal sanctuary of Kamakura, demonstrated a cold, calculating grasp of statesmanship, choosing to remain in the east to build a permanent administrative foundation while sending his brilliant younger half-brothers, Noriori and the legendary Yoshitsune, to lead the white-bannered armies into the thick of battle. Yoshitsune proved to be one of the most spectacularly gifted military geniuses in the entire annals of warfare, a master of speed, deception, and psychological shock tactics that completely nullified the traditional, set-piece strategies of the Taira lords. In the freezing winter of 1184, at the historic Battle of Ichinotani near modern-day Kobe, Yoshitsune achieved a breathtaking victory by leading a compact force of elite mounted archers down an incredibly steep, rocky mountain cliff that the Taira had left entirely unguarded, believing the terrain to be impassable for horses. The sudden, thundering descent of the white cavalry from the clouds threw the Taira stronghold into a state of absolute panic, forcing the Crimson warriors to abandon their burning palaces and flee westward in a chaotic scramble toward their fleets, a blow that permanently shattered their grip on central Japan. The final, apocalyptic act of this epic tragedy unfolded on the 25th of April in the year 1185, along the treacherous, swirling currents of the Shimonoseki Straits, where the two rival dynasties met for a definitive naval confrontation known to history as the Battle of Dan-no-Ura. The Taira, who had spent generations mastering the sea lanes of the inland sea, initially held a powerful tactical advantage, their expert sailors utilizing the fast, shifting morning tides to surround the Minamoto vessels and rain a devastating storm of arrows upon the white decks. But as the hot afternoon advanced, the natural currents of the straits began to slow down and reverse, turning the tide directly into the faces of the Crimson Fleet, while several treacherous regional lords chose this moment of vulnerability to defect to the Minamoto cause, revealing the secret locations of the Taira command ships to the enemy. In a matter of hours, the battle transformed into a savage, floating massacre, with the heavily armored Minamoto warriors boarding the Crimson vessels to put the Taira nobility to the sword without a single shred of mercy. Realizing that the day was lost and that capture would bring an intolerable humiliation, the proud Taira matriarch gathered the child emperor Antoku, who was only 6 years old, into her arms, comforting the crying boy by telling him that a beautiful new palace awaited them beneath the lonely waves before leaping decisively into the dark ocean. The rest of the Taira lords followed their sovereign into the abyss, their heavy iron armor dragging them down into the silent depths of the sea, an emotional ending that marked the absolute annihilation of the clan and left the white banners of the Minamoto flying undisputed over the entire blood-stained plain of the waters. To explore this shifting matrix of power more closely, we must look at how this total victory reshaped the legal and geographic alignments of the provinces, particularly through the reallocation of confiscated lands. Yoritomo did not absorb these conquered territories into his personal estate, choosing instead to parcel them out among the local warriors who had bled for the white banner, effectively creating a sprawling grid of military dependencies across the landscape. This massive transfer of economic assets permanently fractured the old economic dominance of the Kyoto Shun, redirecting the wealth of distant valleys directly into the hands of provincial managers. The code of the field became the absolute standard of right, replacing the courtly precedents of the capital with a harsh, practical jurisprudence that judged a house solely by its contribution to the defense of the military order. With his rivals completely destroyed, Minamoto no Yoritomo stood as the absolute, undisputed master of Japan. But instead of moving his victorious court into the beautiful, fire-ravaged corridors of Kyoto to play the role of traditional aristocrats, he made a visionary choice that altered the constitutional path of the country forever. Yoritomo maintained his permanent capital in Kamakura, far away from the corrupting luxuries and intrigues of the imperial court, and in the year 1192, he compelled the weakened emperor to grant him the supreme, hereditary military title of Sei Taishogun, meaning the barbarian subduing generalissimo. This moment marked the official birth of the Kamakura Shogunate, the world's first true military government, establishing a dual system of rule that would govern Japan for nearly 700 years, where the emperor remained in Kyoto as a sacred, cloistered symbol of divine legitimacy, while the shogun in Kamakura wielded the practical, absolute power of the sword and the ledger. Yoritomo constructed a highly efficient, pragmatic administrative structure designed specifically to manage a feudal society of warriors, creating the systems of Shugo and Jito to secure his grip over the distant provinces. The Shugo were powerful military governors, appointed directly by Kamakura to oversee the defenses, monitor the activities of the local clans, and suppress any flicker of rebellion across entire provinces, while the Jito functioned as land stewards, tasked with collecting the agricultural taxes, settling property disputes, and ensuring the productivity of the vital rice fields. In return for their absolute, unblemished service to the shogunate, these loyal samurai retainers were granted official legal rights to retain a portion of the tax revenues and pass their lands down to their heirs, forming a binding, feudal contract of reciprocal loyalty that anchored the stability of the state, not in the ancient moral laws of Confucianism, but in the practical, shared material interests of the ruling military class. The military stability and feudal contract, established under the white banners of Minamoto no Yoritomo, faced a quiet, domestic transformation at the dawn of the 13th century. Following the sudden death of the first shogun in the year 1199, the direct male lineage of the Minamoto house proved tragically short-lived, with his young sons falling victim to the relentless political intrigues of the warrior elite. Into this sudden vacuum of leadership stepped the Hojo clan, a powerful eastern family whose matriarch, Hojo Masako, the fierce widow of Yoritomo, became known as the Nun Shogun for her extraordinary political acumen. The Hojo masters made a calculating choice not to claim the title of shogun for themselves, instead establishing the permanent position of shikken, or regent, allowing them to govern the empire with an absolute authority, while using young puppet noblemen as figureheads for the Kamakura court. Under the direction of these iron regents, the shogunate refined its legal and administrative consciousness, promulgating the historic Go-Saibai Shikimoku Code in 1232 to regulate the property disputes, vassal obligations, and inheritance rights of the warrior society with an unblemished clarity. This era of pragmatic internal growth nurtured a profound spiritual shift across the islands, driven by the rapid spread of Zen Buddhism from the Asian continent into the daily lives of the samurai elite. Zen's core emphasis on absolute self-discipline, rigorous seated meditation, and the direct acceptance of impermanence resonated deeply with men who lived constantly in the shadow of the sword, transforming the monasteries of Kamakura into vibrant hubs of cultural innovation, dry rock gardens, and minimalist ink paintings. To fully explore the deep current of this military transformation, we must look into the physical fortifications that began to shape the coastlines of the western provinces during this era of preparation. The Hojo regents understood that maintaining a state based on decentralized warrior contracts required an ironclad reputation for administrative fairness and defensive strength. Under the guidance of the Hojo leaders, the court established specialized judicial councils that traveled throughout the provinces, settling boundary conflicts between rival samurai families before these disputes could erupt into regional blood feuds. This legal stability allowed the agricultural output of the country to expand consistently as the Jito land stewards implemented improved iron plow designs and advanced water wheel technologies to drain the low-lying marshes, transforming old wasteland into highly productive rice paddies that fueled the growing economy of the shogunate. Yet, this quiet flowering of medieval culture was destined to face an unprecedented, terrifying, external challenge that threatened to wipe the independent kingdom of Japan completely from the face of the earth. Far across the continental plains, the colossal Mongol Empire had completed its conquest of China and Korea, establishing the Yuan dynasty under the grand authority of Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan. Kublai Khan turned his gaze across the stormy seas toward the Japanese islands, sending a series of imperial envoys to Kamakura, demanding that the shogunate recognize the absolute supremacy of the Mongol throne and pay regular silver tribute to his court. The Hojo regents, viewing these demands as an intolerable insult to national dignity, rejected the imperial proposals with a cold defiance, executing the late envoys on the beaches of Kamakura and ordering every samurai clan along the coasts of Kyushu to prepare for an all-out invasion. The first volcanic eruption of the Mongol war machine struck the shores of Hakata Bay in the late autumn of the year 1274, when an imperial armada of approximately 900 ships carrying 30,000 battle-hardened Mongol, Chinese, and Korean troops crossed the straits. The defending samurai, accustomed to a highly ritualized style of single combat, where warriors announced their elite lineage before engaging an enemy, were shocked by the industrial tactics of the invaders, who advanced in tight, disciplined infantry formations, protected by a wall of shields. The Mongols deployed massed volleys of poisoned arrows, utilized terrifying gunpowder projectiles that exploded in midair with a thunderous roar, and maneuvered with a tactical precision that threw the traditional samurai lines into temporary confusion. Despite these tactical disadvantages, the Japanese warriors fought with a desperate, suicidal ferocity, holding the defensive lines along the beaches throughout a long day of heavy bloodshed until the Mongol commanders chose to withdraw their forces to the safety of their ships for the night. As the dark hours of the midnight sky deepened, a violent autumn storm began to rock the bay, its heavy winds and massive waves tossing the crowded Mongol fleet against the rocky coastlines, destroying hundreds of vessels and forcing the survivors into a hasty, disorganized retreat back to the continent. This narrow escape provided the shogunate with a critical breathing space, and for the next 7 years, the Hojo regents mobilized the resources of the entire nation to transform the beaches of Hakata into an impenetrable fortress, constructing a massive 20-kilometer stone wall along the shoreline to block any future landings. The ultimate trial arrived in the summer of 1281, when Kublai Khan launched an unprecedented invasion force, estimated at over 100,000 troops and 4,000 ships, one of the largest naval operations in human history prior to the modern era, designed to overwhelm the islands through sheer numbers. For weeks, the defensive stone wall of Hakata Bay became a screaming chaos of bronze, iron, and blood, as the massed waves of Mongol infantry attempted to breach the barriers, while the samurai launched daring night raids in small fishing boats to board the giant enemy vessels and put the crews to the sword. The lines held through the blinding heat of the summer months until the middle of August, when a colossal typhoon of miraculous proportions swept through the Tsushima Straits, its howling winds and raging waters smashing the crowded armada against the cliffs for 2 consecutive days. Thousands of Mongol ships were shattered into nameless fragments, and countless soldiers drowned in the swirling currents, an absolute catastrophe that permanently ended Kublai Khan's imperial ambitions toward the islands and left Japan completely independent under its unchanging sky. The ecstatic citizens celebrated this tempest as the kamikaze, the divine wind, sent by the guardian kami of the land, to protect the sacred realm of the emperor, a concept that would echo down the corridors of Japanese history with a powerful, mystical resonance. Yet, though the shogunate had successfully repelled the grandest empire on earth, the economic costs of this multi-decade mobilization proved lethal to the stability of the Kamakura system, hollowing out the financial foundations of the feudal contract. Because the defensive war had yielded no new lands or plundered treasures to distribute as rewards, the cash-strapped shogunate found itself utterly unable to compensate the thousands of loyal samurai who had risked their lives on the beaches of Kyushu. As the warrior clans sank into deep debt and grew increasingly disaffected with the Hojo regency, a spirit of subterranean resentment began to simmer across the provinces, preparing the ground for a dramatic collapse that would bring the first era of military governance to a violent, tragic end. The subterranean resentment that had hollowed out the foundations of the Kamakura system erupted into open revolution in the early decades of the 14th century, when an ambitious emperor named Go-Daigo sought to restore absolute political power to the imperial throne in Kyoto. Joining forces with disaffected samurai commanders who felt betrayed by the Hojo regency, the imperial loyalists launched a coordinated assault that overthrew the first military government in the year 1333, burning the fortress city of Kamakura to the ground. Yet, this restoration of direct imperial rule proved short-lived, as the new court completely ignored the practical economic needs of the warrior class, attempting to revive an archaic, aristocratic hierarchy that was wholly incompatible with a society now dominated by the sword. Realizing the weakness of the throne, a shrewd, powerful general named Ashikaga Takauji turned his weapons against the emperor, seizing the capital of Kyoto in 1336 to install a puppet monarch and declare himself the new shogun. This dramatic shift established the Ashikaga shogunate, also celebrated across the centuries as the Muromachi shogunate, a military regime that chose to maintain its central administration within the busy, cultured quarters of Kyoto itself, rather than the remote plains of the east. This close geographic proximity between the warrior elite and the traditional court aristocracy produced an era of spectacular, unprecedented cultural fusion, transforming the Muromachi capital into a vibrant hub of artistic experimentation and international trade. Under the lavish patronage of successive shoguns, most famously the third leader, Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, the aesthetics of Zen Buddhism reached their absolute peak, birthing the magnificent Golden Pavilion, or Kinkakuji, whose gilded walls rose above a quiet pond to project the ultimate sophistication of the military regime. Within these shaded temple compounds and villas, master artists and monks introduced the monochrome ink painting style known as suibakuga, utilizing bold brushstrokes and subtle washes of dark ink to capture the pristine essence of misty mountains, bamboo groves, and quiet rivers. Garden design underwent an equally profound evolution, perfecting the dry landscape style, or kare-sansui, where raked white gravel and carefully placed rocks were used to symbolize flowing waves and isolated islands, inviting the viewer into a state of deep, meditative contemplation. This era also witnessed the birth of No theatre, a highly stylized form of musical drama that explored themes of transience, historical tragedy, and the presence of spirits, alongside the codification of the tea ceremony, or chanoyu, which elevated the simple act of preparing powdered green tea into a ritual of mindfulness, purity, and aesthetic harmony. To explore this era of intense cultural growth more closely, we must observe how the physical breakdown of public safety forced a complete restructuring of urban and provincial life. As the Ashikaga shoguns spent their immense fortunes on Chinese porcelain imports and elegant poetry gatherings, they gradually lost the ability to enforce the central tax codes outside the capital district. This financial retreat allowed the regional military governors to transform their administrative titles into permanent, hereditary fiefdoms, building localized trade monopolies and minting their own crude copper currencies to fund private garrisons. The merchant class, seeking protection in a world where the central shogunate could no longer guard the highways, organized highly disciplined trading guilds called za, purchasing special tax exemptions from local shrines and fortifying entire market towns to withstand the rising threat of border incursions. Yet, this brilliant flowering of high culture was accompanied by a slow, catastrophic erosion of the shogunate's centralized political authority across the provinces, as the Ashikaga masters increasingly relied on loose alliances with powerful regional lords known as daimyo. Sometime around the middle of the 15th century, the deep factional rivalries within the Ashikaga house and the competing ambitions of the great noble families erupted into an outright, devastating conflict known as the Onin War in 1467. For 10 long years, the capital city of Kyoto was transformed into a smoking, post-apocalyptic labyrinth of ash and blood, as the private armies of the daimyo fought block by block, burning the ancient palaces, libraries and temples to the ground, and reducing the authority of both the emperor and the shogun to a completely meaningless fiction. The destruction of Kyoto marked the definitive collapse of central governance, plunging the entire archipelago into a terrifying 100-year dark age of continuous civil conflict, known to history as the Sengoku period, or the Warring States era. Across the length of Japan, the land was fractured into hundreds of independent, highly militarized domains, each ruled by an ambitious daimyo who fought a relentless rearguard action against his neighbors to secure survival and expand his borders. The landscape evolved into a country of fortresses, as the lords constructed massive, heavily fortified castles on strategic hills and plains, surrounding their multi-tiered wooden keeps with deep moats, thick stone walls, and high palisades that functioned as both military bastions and busy administrative centers. This era of total mobilization completely shattered the traditional rules of samurai warfare, transforming the battlefield from a theater of individualized combat into an arena of large-scale industrial violence. The traditional mounted archers were replaced by vast armies of ashigaru, disciplined peasant infantrymen armed with massive long spears who could move in tight, coordinated formations to break a cavalry charge under the direction of their lords. The face of war changed forever in the year 1543, when a storm-tossed Chinese vessel carrying Portuguese traders arrived on the southern island of Tanegashima, introducing European firearms to the shores of Japan and providing the ambitious Sengoku daimyos with a lethal technology that would soon turn the tide of history, preparing the ground for a new breed of unifiers who would rebuild the nation from the ashes of the century. The chaos of the Sengoku period, which had fractured the Japanese islands into a patchwork of warring domains for over a century, began to narrow toward a definitive, monumental resolution in the late 16th century under the blades of three extraordinary leaders. The first of these unifiers was Oda Nobunaga, a brilliant, ruthless warlord who grasped the absolute potential of European firearms, rotating volleys of musketry behind wooden stockades at the historic Battle of Nagashino in 1575 to utterly destroy the traditional samurai cavalry. Nobunaga broke the military power of the militant Buddhist leagues and dissolved the remnants of the Ashikaga shogunate, but his sudden betrayal and ritual suicide in 1582 left the grand task of national unification incomplete. His principal general, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a man of genius who had risen from the humble ranks of a peasant foot soldier, immediately claimed the mantle of leadership, subduing the remaining regional daimyos through a sophisticated mixture of military campaigns and shrewd diplomacy. Hideyoshi implemented sweeping structural reforms that locked the population into a rigid social matrix, conducting the historic sword hunt of 1588 to disarm the peasantry and launching massive land surveys to standardize the national economy based on the productivity of the rice fields. But following Hideyoshi's death in 1598, the delicate balance of his regency quickly fractured, pulling the country once more toward an all-out civil conflict between those loyal to the Toyotomi legacy and those who aligned themselves with the rising power of the East. The definitive axis of Japanese history was decided on the 21st of October in the year 1600, along the fog-bound, muddy fields of a misty valley within Mino province, where the two massive coalitions met for the largest clash in the annals of the archipelago, the historic Battle of Sekigahara. The Eastern Army, commanded by the patient, calculating strategist Tokugawa Ieyasu, secured a total shattering triumph over the Western forces, utilizing years of secret diplomatic negotiations and promised land grants to trigger massive defections within the enemy lines mid-battle. In the year 1603, Ieyasu was formally granted the supreme title of shogun by the emperor, establishing his new capital far to the east within a small fishing village named Edo, the colossal metropolis that would evolve into modern-day Tokyo, and inaugurating an unprecedented era of stability known as the Edo period. To ensure that the fires of the Sengoku chaos could never return to burn the plain, the Tokugawa Shogunate engineered a highly sophisticated, total system of political control. Most famously, the policy of Sankin Kotai, or alternata tendance. This meticulous law required every regional daimyo to spend every alternating year living under the direct watch of the shogun in Edo, leaving their wives and children behind as permanent hostages when they returned to their provincial domains, an arrangement that completely drained their financial resources and neutralized their capacity to fund independent military rebellions. The shogunate also finalized the isolationist foreign policy known as Sakoku, banning Christianity outright after the bloody Shimabara Rebellion of 1637, and restricting all foreign commerce exclusively to Chinese merchants and the Dutch East India Company, who were confined to the tiny, artificial island of Dejima in Nagasaki Harbor. This controlled isolation allowed Japan's domestic economy and unique urban culture to flourish within a beautifully self-contained framework for over 250 years, a long peace, where the samurai class transitioned from fierce battlefield warriors into a peaceful, literate elite of administrators and bureaucrats. In the buzzing quarters of Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto, a vibrant popular culture blossomed around the floating world of the ukiyo, birthing the colorful dynamics of kabuki theater, the profound puppetry of bunraku, and the magnificent woodblock prints of master artists like Hokusai and Hiroshige, who mass-produced breathtaking landscapes that captured the emotional soul of the townspeople. To understand this long piece more deeply, we must look at how this rigid social division and geographical confinement fostered a uniquely resilient domestic network. The shogunate divided society into 4 permanent hereditary classes, with the samurai at the absolute summit, followed by the common farmers, the artisans, and the merchants at the very base of the pyramid. While this system restricted social mobility, the absolute security of the highways and the standardization of measures allowed trade networks to expand rapidly along the coastal sea lanes and major roads. The merchant guilds grew immensely wealthy within the urban centers, developing sophisticated banking practices and early credit systems to manage the rice revenues flowing into the central markets, establishing a rich foundation of capital that transformed the small fishing ports into bustling commercial centers. Yet, this long, insulated tranquility was destined to face a shattering awakening in the summer of 1853, when Commodore Matthew Perry sailed a squadron of massive, smoke-belching American warships into Edo Bay, an event that would be remembered forever across the islands as the arrival of the Black Ships. The sight of these modern machine vessels, bristling with long-range artillery and completely immune to traditional coastal defenses, delivered an absolute psychological shock to the nation, exposing the technological gap that had widened between Japan and the industrializing West during the centuries of isolation. Recognizing its inability to resist militarily, the shogunate signed a series of humiliating, unequal treaties that granted extraterritorial rights to foreigners and stripped Japan of its tariff autonomy, a concession that rapidly ignited a wildfire of domestic unrest and anti-Tokugawa sentiment across the southern domains. The political crisis reached its revolutionary climax in the year 1868, when the combined forces of Satsuma and Choshu overthrew the last shogun, declaring the Meiji Restoration to return supreme political sovereignty to the young Emperor Meiji, and shifting the imperial court permanently from the ancient palaces of Kyoto to the new capital of Tokyo. The Meiji leaders launched one of the most blindingly rapid, comprehensive modernization programs in the story of the human race, systematically dismantling the ancient feudal class systems, expanding universal education, and building railways, telegraph networks, and massive industrial factories under the unifying formula of Western technology, Japanese spirit. In less than a single generation, Japan transformed itself from a fragmented, agrarian, feudal realm into a highly centralized, industrialized global superpower, demonstrating its immense martial edge by defeating both the Qing and Russian empires in modern warfare to announce its emergence on the world stage. Our long, immersive journey through the history of Japan has now reached its complete and peaceful conclusion, moving across the vast ocean of time, from the first prehistoric Jōmon hunters who pressed cords into the wet river clay to the brilliant, modernizing reformers of the Meiji era. We have traced a magnificent tapestry of resilience, continuity, and adaptation, a story of a people who learned to absorb the new practices of the continent and the technology of the West without ever losing the deep, distinctive pulse of their own cultural identity. But now, the heavy pace of the century slows down, and the loud ambitions, the clashes of the samurai phalanxes, the debates of the courts, and the smoke of the burning castles grow quieter as we step back into the dark. The sounds of the marching armies and the buzzing streets of old Edo fade away completely into memory, leaving behind a profound, soothing hush that belongs only to the quiet hours of the night on the History Before Sleep channel. You might picture a quiet, isolated shoreline along the coast of Kyushu, the gentle waves lapping rhythmically against the stone walls of Hakata Bay as the tide recedes, carrying the long echoes of the centuries out into the deep ocean. The lanterns of the great temple gardens are still, their soft light glowing faintly across the raked gravel and moss of the Zen sanctuaries, casting long, peaceful shadows that blur the boundaries between the past and the present. In this deep calm, let your breathing become slow and steady, matching the eternal rhythm of the wind that sighs through the tall forest trees and over the empty mounds of the ancient kings. Put on your headphones, pull the blankets close, let the immense weight of time slip away from your thoughts, and surrender completely to the beautiful, silent embrace of the night as the long story of Japan whispers you to a deep, undisturbed sleep.